This is Aion class number 17, and it covers paragraph 267 to 286, which is chapter 12, titled The Background to the Psychology of Christian Alchemical Symbolism. I have 5 themes I want to deal with tonight. Number 1 is the importance of myth and dogma. Number 2 is 2 parallel worldviews. Number 3, the Christian creed. Number 4, anamnesis. And number 5, the Apostle Paul in Athens. This assignment, I think you will agree, is something of a respite, a little easier to read than many of the others, because in it, Jung is just talking to us and not presenting the heavy factual material of the Psyche. But we'll get back to that next time. But the chapter does continue a theme that was sounded in the last chapter, which I've taken as my number 1 theme, the importance of myth and dogma. Remember that came up last time, and there were some questions came up about it, and I want to return to the paragraph that referred to it, which was paragraph 259. Reread a portion of it anyway. Without the existence of conscious concepts of apperception, let's reread that. For without the existence of conscious concepts, apperception is, as we know, impossible. This explains numerous neurotic disturbances which arise from the fact that certain contents are constellated in the unconscious that cannot be assimilated owing to the lack of apperceptive concepts that would grasp them. That is why it's so extremely important to tell children fairy tales and legends and to inculcate religious ideas or dogmas into grown-ups. Because these things are instrumental symbols with whose help unconscious contents can be canalized into consciousness, interpreted, and integrated. Failing this, their energy flows off into conscious contents which normally are not much emphasized and intensifies them to pathological proportions. We then get apparently groundless phobias and obsessions, phrases, idiosyncrasies, hypochondriac ideas, and intellectual perversions suitably camouflaged in social, religious, or political garb. See, the idea here is that the archetypes of the unconscious, in order to have an appropriate effect on the ego, in order to have their effects transmitted to ego consciousness, need to have bridges on which to reach consciousness. And these bridges are supplied by religious and mythological images and ideas that already exist as an accepted part of consciousness. That's why knowledge of myths and religious dogma Jung considers to be so important, because those images function as bridges that allow the effects of the archetypes of the unconscious entry, so to speak, into consciousness. If the conscious ego is lacking such ideas, then these archetypal energies flow into containers that are too small for them. I want to give you an example of that, an example that Jung uses. He considers it pretty important because he used it in his Terry lectures. So you can find this example starting in paragraph 19 of volume 11. And this is Psychology and Religion, the Terry lectures. In these lectures, he describes a patient who was gripped by the compulsive idea that he had cancer of the intestines. And although he went through repeated exhaustive medical examinations and was repeatedly assured that there was no physical basis, that didn't make any difference. He was convinced that he had it, or at the very least, if he didn't have it, he might have it. And it amounted to the same thing. So Jung then talks about this particular case as an example. So he says, what shall we now reply to our patient with the imaginary cancer? I would tell him, yes, my friend, you are really suffering from a cancer-like thing. You really harbor a deadly evil. It won't kill your body, but it will eventually kill your soul. It has already spoiled and poisoned your human relations and your personal happiness. And it will go on increasing until it has swallowed your whole psychic existence. It is obvious to our man that he's not the originator of his morbid imagination, although his theoretical mind will certainly suggest that he's the owner and maker of his own imagination. We would never imagine that we were responsible for a real cancer, but when it comes to the psyche, we instantly feel a kind of responsibility, as if we were the makers of our own psychical condition. And skipping on, it's to my mind a fatal mistake to consider the human psyche as a merely personal affair, and to explain it exclusively from a personal standpoint. This only applies this personal approach in ordinary everyday reactions. But some slight trouble occurs, and then a whole new level emerges. That's the archetypal level. And collective forces rush up. And he says, as a matter of fact, we're always living on as a volcano. Our cancer case shows clearly how impotent human reason and intellect are against the most palpable nonsense. I always advise my patients to take such obvious but invincible nonsense as the manifestation of a power and meaning not yet understood. Our case is confronted with a willpower and a suggestion more than equal to anything his consciousness can put against it. In this precarious situation, it would be bad strategy to convince the patient he is somehow, though in a highly incomprehensible way, at the back of his own symptom, secretly inventing and supporting it. Such a suggestion would instantly paralyze his fighting spirit, and he would get demoralized. It is much better if he understands that his complex is an autonomous power directed against his conscious personality. In other words, God. His cancer phobia is a manifestation of the inner God image, an autonomous power that transcends the capacity of the ego. And this is an example of Jung's remarks in paragraph 259 of how archetypal energies that, if they do not have adequate bridges into consciousness, then flow into containers that are too small for them. Theme number 2, two parallel worldviews. This theme is brought up in paragraphs 267 and 268, where Jung says, today we're witnessing the curious spectacle of two parallel worldviews, neither of which knows or wishes to know anything about the other. And then down to the next paragraph, he says, in the course of the 18th century, there arose that notorious rift between faith and knowledge. Faith lacked experience, and science missed out the soul. Instead, science believed fervently in absolute objectivity and assiduously overlooked fundamental difficulty that the real vehicle and begetter of all knowledge is the psyche, the very thing that scientists knew the least about for the longest time. The two worldviews, then, are one, the world of faith, only an antiquated, concretistic, parochial religious faith, and everybody's faith is always assumed to be the only really true one. That's the one worldview, and the other worldview is a secularized, rationalistic, soulless science. With eyes to see, you look around and you see this conflict everywhere in the outer world, just everywhere. And as Jung says in another place, in paragraph 280, a conflict of opposites can never be reconciled on their own level. They can only be reconciled by finding a third position that's on a new level. And Jungian psychology provides that third position, which is capable of reconciling these two parallel worldviews. And it's not only the collective psyche that's split in this fashion, but the same split occurs in great numbers of individuals. Of course, there are a great many individuals who identify with either one side or the other, one or the other of these two opposing worldviews. But there are also a good number of individuals who carry both viewpoints within them and keep them in compartments, and in part of their lives live out of one of the viewpoints, and in another part of their lives live out the other viewpoint. And since they never connect with each other, they don't experience any conflict. But if the analyst tries to bring those two hermetically sealed compartments together, then there's an explosion. Then you meet the most violent resistance. The other kind of issue that often comes up in analytic practice is how to deal with individuals who are largely identified with one or the other of these two standpoints. Those identified with the secular rationalistic attitude very often need to be introduced to mythological and religious imagery. And the dreams will often suggest that procedure. On the other hand, those who are identified in a traditional concretistic faith often have to be introduced to Voltaire or his equivalent, the rationalist who analyzed away religious faith. Speaking of Voltaire, I use his name particularly because of the fact that really surprised me the first time I learned it, namely that on the landing of the stairs leading to Jung's study, where he did his analytic work, was a statue of Voltaire. And Jung told some interviewer, that he got that statue there to remind him of his shadow.
He was also condemned by the Catholic Church. They he was on the Individuation.
Well, I would think so. I would think so. Concerning this matter of the conflict and the resolution, Jung makes a comment in paragraph 282. The problems which the integration of the unconscious sets modern doctors and psychologists can only be solved along the lines traced out by history. And the upshot will be a new assimilation of the traditional myth. This, however, presupposes the continuity of historical development. Naturally, the present tendency to destroy all tradition or render it unconscious could interrupt the normal process of development for several hundred years and substitute an interlude of barbarism. In fact, I take this remark to be a prediction, because the present tendency to destroy all tradition is already so far advanced that in our collective operations in our education system, that it seems like it's certain to run its course in just this fashion. Item number 3, the Christian Creed. Jung refers to the Christian Creed in paragraph 270. Our Christian doctrine is a highly differentiated symbol that expresses the transcendent psyche, the God image, and its properties, to speak with Jung. The Creed is a symbolum. This comprises practically everything of importance that can be ascertained about the manifestations of the psyche in the field of inner experience. But it does not include nature, at least not in any recognizable form. Consequently, in every period of Christianity, there have been subsidiary currents or undercurrents that have sought to investigate the empirical aspect of nature, not only from the outside, but also from the inside. He then goes on to say that the word dogma has even acquired somewhat unpleasant sound, and seems actually serves merely to emphasize the rigidity of a prejudice. And most people living in the West, it's lost its meaning as a symbol for a virtually unknown and yet actual operative fact. And following up on these remarks, and on the earlier remarks that in which Jung says how important it is that consciousness be furnished with dogmatic images, dogmatic ideas. Let's take a look at what the Christian dogma actually is, which is what has been the operative myth for the Aion now ending. For those of you that are interested in a little more detail, you'll find a summary of the Christian dogma or creed at the conclusion of the Episcopal Book of Common Prayer, which lays out the so-called Articles of Religion, the fundamental dogmatic beliefs that constitute Anglican Christianity. But if we go back to the early part of the Aion, we find much simpler versions of the creed that will give you a picture of what the basic dogma of our Aion has been. This is a variation of the Nicene Creed, and I take it from Jung's essay on the Trinity in comes from paragraph 217 of volume 11. Here's one concise version of the Christian dogma, just so you know what the basic images are that underlie the Western psyche for the last 2,000 years. We believe in one God, the Father Almighty, maker of heaven and earth, and all things visible and invisible, and in one Lord Jesus Christ, the only begotten Son, begotten of his Father, God of God, light of light, begotten, not made, being of one substance with the Father, by whom all things were made. Who for us man and for our salvation came down from heaven and was made flesh by the Holy Ghost and the Virgin Mary, and became man, and was crucified for us under Pontius Pilate, suffered and was buried, and on the third day rose up again, according to the Scriptures, and ascended into heaven, and sitteth on the right hand of God the Father, whence he shall come again in glory to judge the quick and the dead, and whose kingdom shall have no end. And we believe in the Holy Ghost, the Lord and giver of life, who proceedeth from the Father and from the Son, who with the Father and the Son together is worshipped and glorified, who spoke through the prophets. And we believe in one holy, Catholic, and apostolic church. We acknowledge one baptism for the remission of sins, and we await the resurrection of the dead and the life of the world to come. That's it. All in one concise package. And as you can well imagine, if that body of images were an absolute conviction, if you could live out of it with certainty, your life is all set for you. You're contained. You see, this religious creed can now be understood as a symbolic expression of psychic reality. Namely, it's an expression of the process of individuation. It tells us, first of all, that there is a God image that is the creator and origin of everything. It tells us that one aspect of that God image descended to earth, incarnated in a man, in other words, manifested in an ego, that is the self on its own initiative incarnated in an ego, and with redemptive intentions, but with intention to rescue that ego. And the redemption will mean psychologically to bring it a sense of meaning. This aspect of the self then reascended to where it came from, indicating that that incarnation was not a perpetual event, but a temporary one, and that there's going to be a second coming, a second manifestation of the ego's encounter with the self, and that second manifestation, there's going to be a different kind of experience. It's going to be a last judgment experience. That will then be followed by a general resurrection, a resolution of all repressed complexes, and the establishment of an eternal kingdom. In other words, the establishment of the eternal dimension of the psyche, a translation or transition from the temporal experience of existence to something of a transpersonal, atemporal nature. Now that's just a very brief elaboration. If you're interested in more, you can read my book, The Christian Archetype, which goes into it some detail. Item number 4, anamnesis. You remember this theme has come up before, but it comes up again, and it's worth reiterating since it's such an important one in practical analysis. It comes up in paragraph 279. When a living organism is cut off from its roots, it loses the connections with the foundations of its existence and must necessarily perish. When that happens, anamnesis of the origins is a matter of life and death. And then he goes on to say that myths and fairy tales give expression to the unconscious processes, and their retelling causes these processes to come alive again, so that they promote the anamnesis process. And then down in paragraph 281, he says that the healing and renewing properties of this symbolic water point to the therapeutic character of the mythological background. That's an important phrase. The therapeutic character of the mythological background. That's part of the anamnesis experience. And I also just want to remind you of our earlier reference to anamnesis, which is in paragraph 73, page 40, where he says, in exact agreement with the empirical findings of psychology, there is an ever-present archetype of wholeness, which may easily disappear from the purview of consciousness or may never be perceived at all until a consciousness illuminated by conversion recognizes it in the figure of Christ. As a result of this anamnesis, the original state of oneness with the God image is restored. It brings about an integration, a bridging of the split in the personality. And as I mentioned on that earlier occasion, analysis to a very large extent is an anamnesis. It's a remembering of what has gone before. And there are two dimensions to that analytic anamnesis. There's the personal dimension and the collective or archetypal dimension. So first we examine the personal history, and the individual goes through a deliberate personal remembering of his personal past, and which opens up his personal unconscious. Then if he's meant to proceed deeper, then his dreams lead him beyond that into the collective dimension of the anamnesis, which involves an archetypal, historical remembering, first of all, of his family, his ancestral background, his tribe, his nation, and then the archetypal level of humanity as a whole. And finally, he gets that deep one's origins from the universe itself. I want to emphasize how important I think it is that every analysis begin with a careful, systematic scrutiny of the individual history. I think one should uniformly, at the beginning of each analysis, ask the prospective analysand to write a personal biography with emphasis on those aspects of their life history that have the most libido charge to them, for both positive and negative, and that one then go through that biography in some detail, and subjecting it to the analytic dialogue, so that the review becomes part of the living experience of the analysis. I think it's very important that you begin every analysis in that orderly and systematic way with that kind of a personal anamnesis. It gets the analysis off the right start, rather than a meandering. If you see, this procedure corresponds to the Platonic idea of anamnesis, which is usually translated recollection. As Plato says in the Phaedo, if we acquired knowledge before we were born and lost it at birth, but afterwards, by the use of our senses, regained the knowledge which we had previously possessed, would not process which we call learning really be recovering knowledge which is our own? And should we not be right in calling this recollection, calling this anamnesis? That's the That's the Greek word. See, what Plato is saying here, and to put it in a phrase, is that all cognition is recognition. All knowing is re-knowing. All knowing is remembering knowledge we once had. Now, that's not literally true as we understand our experience, but it's psychologically true in terms of the process of the exploration of the unconscious in both its personal and its archetypal layers. We were once in touch with both those layers. We knew it all once before, knew in quotation marks, but then we forgot it. And in the course of developing consciousness, even if we're not neurotic, the very process of consciousness involves a split between the ego and the unconscious. And so that the phenomenon of consciousness itself brings about a split from one's roots. And if we can remember where we came from, if we can go through that process of anamnesis, then we can recover our lost points. Point number 5. The Apostle Paul in Athens. This reference is found in paragraph 275. If Paul were alive today and should undertake to reach the ear of intelligent Londoners in Hyde Park, he could no longer contain himself with quotations from Greek literature and a smattering of Jewish history. He'd have to extend himself farther afield. But the idea here that I want to elaborate a bit is the idea that comes up in the image of Paul's visit to Athens, which took place at the beginning of this eon. See, Paul was in the process of introducing to the ancient world a new world view. And something analogous is taking place now at the beginning of the next eon. Jungian psychology has the task of introducing to the world a new world view. And so the experience of Paul in Athens, which Jung alludes to several places in his works, is relevant as a kind of traditional pattern of a recurrent issue. When he was in Athens, Paul gave a speech before the Council of the Areopagus, and this is described in the 17th chapter of Acts. And he starts out by saying, "Men of Athens, I've seen for myself how extremely scrupulous you are in all religious matters, because I noticed as I strolled around admiring your sacred monuments that you had an altar inscribed to an unknown God. Well, the God whom I proclaim is in fact the one whom you already worship without knowing it." You see, he slips right in to the established standpoint. And then farther down in this speech, he also quotes a Greek poet that stated that we are all God's children, and make use of that passage too. See, this image of Paul preaching to the Athenians is a traditional pattern indicating how to proceed for the introduction of a new level of consciousness to the world. It must be done by relating the new insights to the traditional ideas of the past. Jung puts it very clearly in volume 14, Mysterium, in paragraph 521, when he says, any renewal not deeply rooted in the best spiritual tradition is ephemeral. Any renewal not deeply rooted in the best spiritual tradition is ephemeral. But the dominant that grows from historical roots acts like a living being within the ego-bound man. He does not possess it. It possesses him. You see, if you reflect on this remark, you'll realize that Jung is here describing his modus operandi. This is the basic principle on which he writes his books. That's why they're so full of amplification and traditional imagery that is being presented and seen in a new way in the light of depth psychology. But he knows that unless the psychological insights that he is presenting are rooted in the best spiritual tradition of the past, they're ephemeral. They won't survive. And Paul's method in talking to the Athenians is the same method then that Jung is using in a much more sophisticated way in his works. Because Jungian psychology today is in an analogous position to Christianity, what Christianity was 2,000 years ago. And that means that it must relate itself to the traditional imagery that it is destined to replace. And as part of that process, alchemical symbolism is particularly helpful because it provides a bridge between the traditional Christian dogmatic images and the modern scientific mind. That's one reason that Jung found it so very helpful for his purposes.